Hare Krishna and good evening, dear devotees. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the Many Moons podcast. Tonight, we are here with the 18th episode, and we're focusing on child protection in ISKCON. Our session is entitled Educate the Children with Love, which is a phrase from Srila Prabhupada, and our guest speaker tonight is Dhira Govinda. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Prabhu. We appreciate taking the time out of your very full schedule.
Thank you, Sharidia Ross. I'm honored to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So for those of you that are not familiar with Dhira Govinda Prabhu, he was the founder and the director of the CPO, the ISKCON Child Protection Office, from 1998 until 2004, if I remember correctly.
Correct.
And in his professional capacity, he is a qualified social worker. He also did his PhD in social work. He's also worked in child protection outside of ISKCON. In addition to that, he has published several books and several academic articles. He also served, in his very early years, he served in the Middle East as a temple president and also as a Sankirtan leader, and later he served as one of the board of directors of ISKCON New Raman Team. So he has got a lot of experience in leadership. And he has also founded the Satov Transformational Coaching Institute, and he still conducts various trainings and various seminars through the institute. So he's a very dynamic person, someone that's definitely very experienced and very knowledgeable in the field of psychology, in the field of leadership, and then also in the field of child protection. So we're very grateful that he is with us tonight. So we are discussing the issue of child abuse. As many devotees know, there was extensive child abuse in ISKCON's initial Gurukuls in the 1970s and also up until the early 1990s. However, many devotees are under an impression that child abuse is something of the past and it's something that has been dealt with. Unfortunately, that is not the reality, and we are aware that the CPO is still frequently receiving reports of child abuse, and a lot of it is still connected to ISKCON schools, especially those that still are boarding schools. Now, most of the schools in the Western world, as the US, etc., are no longer boarding schools, and they no longer have serious issues of child abuse. However, there are many schools connected to ISKCON, especially in India and in other countries. And unfortunately, we've seen that abuse issues are continuing in those schools. So for that reason, we feel that it is imperative that we speak about this topic, not because we want to vilify anyone, not because we want to discourage anyone, and not because we want to harm anyone's faith, but because we feel that we should raise awareness of the issue. We should raise awareness of what preventative measures we can take, and we should raise awareness of what we as individuals all can do to make sure that ISKCON is a safe and encouraging, supportive environment for its children. So, Prabhu, with that introduction, I think we can start with our questions.
Thank you, Sharadia, for that lovely introduction, and welcome to the session, Prabhu. Can I just start with the question? Because, like Sharadia mentioned, you started this con CPO. What motivated you to start this service? And just, I know CPO as it is now wasn't exactly as it was when you started. So, what was the main function of the CPO that you established, and what actually motivated you to start it?
Thank you, Dee. I started the CPO because I was asked to. The ISKCON Governing Body Commission, the GBC, asked me to. That was back in March 1998. And I had education and training and experience both, like in Pennsylvania and in the state of Florida. I had served in various positions like children and family counselor for the Department of Foster Care, medical social worker for Children's Medical Services, social work services program supervisor. So I had that experience. And also, like, starting in 1995, I first came to the Alachua Gainesville community in 1992. Starting in 1995, just locally in the devotee communities, there were some allegations of child abuse. And so the devotees kind of knew I had counseling experience, social work experience. So I started being involved in investigations and therapy like that. And so in 1998, the GBC asked me, because they said they wanted to establish, I mean, there's a whole context of reasons why at that time the GBC wanted to establish an international central office of child protection. I won't go into that here, but so in 1997, the GBC established a child protection task force. I was not on that. I wasn't on that. And then the task force recommended to establish an international office, and the task force they issued a child protection task force report, and they said, here's guidelines for this international office, and the guidelines included have a director. And so I accepted there was nothing in me like, oh, I really want to do child protection in Prabhupada's movement. There was nothing in me like had a plan or an intention, but I was requested. And so I figured, okay, I thought about it for a little while, a few days. And I figured, okay, I'm taking this as Super Soul Srila Prabhupada's indication that I have maybe some distinctive qualifications to offer this service. So I was glad to offer it. And we also, soon after that, we hired Ijya Das Prabhu as secretary of the office. That was back in March 98. So I was asked to do it. I figured, okay, I have some training and experience that I'm, somewhat suitable for this service. And okay, the main functions, and that's described in the task force report. I will say that task force formed in 97. They did an excellent job in creating a manual for the functioning of the International Child Protection Office. They did an excellent job. You might say myself and Ijya, we kind of gave that, we kind of gave the guidelines of that report. We gave it hands and legs and put it into action. But within a few months, certainly a few years, we had professionals in the area of law and therapists for children for adults who abuse the children, therapists for perpetrators, and professional social workers. And they would write glowing testimonials about what ISKCON's doing through the Child Protection Office structure. They said, like other continental and international organizations, this is an example for them, whether spiritual, religious, secular. So the task force report, they did excellently in creating those guidelines, and then we endeavored to fill in, to give that life. And then, of course, once we had experience, then there were some things in the guidelines needed to be tweaked, needed to be changed. And that process has continued since I left the Child Protection Office in 2004, some tweaking, but they did an excellent job in creating the guidelines. The basic functions, were for like a clearinghouse resource center for anyone connected with Prabhupada's movement or even outside Prabhupada's movement, any sort of information about child protection, child abuse, child neglect, and we had the investigation function and adjudication function to adjudicate allegations of child abuse. Something I want to say in that regard is that, I don't know how this will sound, but I never saw myself as an advocate for children in this service. It's true for me. I never saw myself. And sometimes I've been appreciated. Oh, you advocated for the children. And I never saw myself that way. Like if we were investigating, I was equally ready to find evidence that would convict an alleged child abuser or that would acquit. I was never out to get anyone or anything like that. Okay, and then another function we had, like, I'll call it like education, right? To develop training programs, locally, internationally, education programs for child maltreatment prevention. Establishing child protection teams, and that everyone in Prabhupada's movement, especially those in leadership positions, that they're educated how to, what might be a red flag, a warning signal, how to prevent. Also, we had a grant program, kind of like, and there were particular eligibility qualifications where we would give grants for youth who were maltreated in ISKCON to get therapy or for their education for a degree. So those were like the major functions.
Thank you, Prabhu. And it looked like it obviously covered a wide range of supportive activities. But I also wanted to cover. Sorry, is there an echo? Let me just.
There was an echo, but I think it's gone now.
Okay, sorry. I just wanted to touch base, Prabhu. What barriers did you or the CPO at that time had to overcome to serve those functions that you just described?
Barriers like obstacles or challenges. Well, we got a lot of support. I mean, there's, that there is, especially as things went on after a few months, year or two, in terms of the investigation and adjudication, we would find, and this has become well known over the past, especially 3-4 years. I've been on many interviews and podcasts that that especially like if it was a high profile person who was like found to have committed some child maltreatment, then oftentimes the leadership, not everyone, I'm not painting with too broad a brush, but many in the leadership, then they would not enforce. They would not enforce the rectification plan, and so there was like different tiers in the so-called justice system. So so that was definitely one thing. That was definitely one thing, and and I would say as years went on, as we got into, myself personally, as I got into my second or third year, I was giving less and less attention to investigation and adjudication, still some, and more attention to the healing, to the restoration on a personal, individual basis, and things like that. And so I know Sharadi Arashi mentioned about the Safito transformational seminars. Well, one of our seminars, in fact, just recently I conducted a Safitov advanced seminar. It's a 7-day seminar. I conducted one in Davos, Switzerland, and we were hosted by Kamini and Keshavacharya at their place in Davos. But so the Safitov advanced seminar, myself and Marie Glasheen, Malini Devi Dasi, we kind of co-developed that, particularly for the purpose for the healing of youth who were maltreated in ISKCON. So as years went on, I was focusing more and more on like the healing and on that personal level. Certainly, and then there were obstacles. I would call it, I mentioned one where, like, for high profile abusers, the decisions would not be enforced, and then of course amongst mass members of the movement, that would erode their trust in leadership. And then there were many other obstacles that became more and more apparent, and that are clearly still active, related to the consciousness. I'll say the consciousness of the organization. Of course, what that really means is the consciousness of some critical mass of individuals who identify with the organization, especially in leadership positions, but not just in leadership positions. So a consciousness of a lack of even valuing the principle of personal accountability, a consciousness of again, not amongst everyone, but enough to be like irksome, like a consciousness of lack of basic common sense. Like I remember, we would issue an official decision with some rectification and some restrictions, maybe amongst a particular someone who committed child abuse and who has maybe friends in high places or is himself a prominent person. And then we would receive things. I remember like trying to explain. Like we would receive comments like, well, okay, he did this and that to children, but what's it matter if he gives a class? If he knows the shlokas, what's it matter? So the reason I'm saying things like okay, like you're there in London, you're there in South Africa, I'm here in Florida. So I would say like probably about like 99.8% of the population, I'm not talking devotee population, just the average population of the towns where we live, they could understand that that if someone is known to have severely maltreated a child, maybe physically, maybe rape, maybe like that, and then they're seen in this leadership position and they're seen as a great spiritual authority, that would be like putting a knife in the wound, that would intensify the wounding, not just of the child or children who are now younger, but of the family members and the friends. Like anyone could understand that, but like I would be like needing to try to explain to those in like influential leadership positions in the organization how like it's really not a good thing if they're child abusers and then they're seen in leadership. So I could go on and on about that sort of mentality, that sort of consciousness. So that was a sort of challenge and an obstacle, still is.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Prabhu. So you made it clear now that one of the challenges that the CPO faced, and I think still faces, in performing its function of protecting children is related to the consciousness. Now, related to that, how has ISKCON conceptualized children? So how has ISKCON thought about children in ways which have also contributed to abuse or enabling the culture of abuse?
Okay, well, thanks for that, Sharadia Ross. Yes, okay. So, of course, again, I don't want to overgeneralize because ISKCON's an institution and it's made of individuals, and amongst the thousands of individuals, there's different mentalities towards children. Some of them quite healthy, loving, and nurturing. So we understand that. But at the same time, yeah. So if I look like from like a viewpoint of a historical sweep, maybe from some sociological organizational analysis. Yeah, so like there could be, I've seen mentalities that, well, and this is still prominent in some places in my experience and maybe more prominent in other places going back 40 years. Like, oh, the children born into the movement, they're Vaikuntha children, therefore they're definitely going to be just like Prahlad Maharaj, and so we don't really need to do much. Okay, again, so that we don't, it doesn't really matter what we do. They're pure devotees. Okay, so then and again, I'm speaking in generalities here. Then maybe as decades went on, it's just like they're not all coming out like Prahlad Maharaj. Oh, what's happening here? Okay, so then there could be like a shift of the pendulum, and be like, yeah, wow. No matter what we do, because like, starting when they were 2 years old, I told them they have to chant japa, and they have to come to Bhagavatam class. No matter what we do, they're going to become materialists. They're karmis. They're going to get into all sorts of degraded activity. So is it just another version of it? It's not really worthwhile to give individual extensive, loving, nurturing attention. So again, these are mentalities that somewhat prominent. I've seen over the generations. I imagine they're still prominent. I mean, based on what I see. And then, different misrepresentations, misuses of the philosophy. Could be, okay, well, if something happens to them as children, then that's their karma. That's their karma. So say that's there to avoid me being responsible for turning a blind eye, for not being appropriately protective. And, of course, like this Vaishnava philosophy, the philosophy of Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatam, it's the most, in my experience in life, most beautiful, sophisticated, like yet simple, beautiful, grounded, logical, rational philosophy to encourage the radiant expansion of spirit. And so at the same time, it's been in very sad, twisted ways misused, like to use because actually the principle of karma, it's meant to move us to radical 100% personal responsibility. It's not meant to justify hard-hearted lack of empathy like that. And in general, kind of like a view towards children, sometimes among some in the institution, kind of like, children are an opportunity for me to do a philosophical experiment like that. And it's not even like a bona fide philosophical experiment based on the Siddhanta given by Prabhupada. Just in like, I got some idea. Okay, I could give examples. I don't think I'll do that. But like rather than this is a personal spiritual being in this human experience in the child's body, and this is an opportunity to cultivate personal relationship, and this is not like an experiment for my profit, adoration, and distinction. No, this is a person, and let me cultivate a consciousness to relate to this person in the child body or the teen body, such that we're supporting each other in our cleansing of consciousness and spiritual growth. So that, like as a twisted philosophical experiment, and that's, maybe I'm being a little animated here, but it's taken some very vicious forms.
Thank you so much for sharing, Prabhu. I think what I really got from that is the utmost importance of us seeing our roles towards children as that of caretakers and facilitators and nourishers. And I think in many parts of ISKCON, in many communities, and in many individuals, we've rather actually failed to take our responsibility towards the children. And as you've rightly put out, we've seen children, either as almost like a nuisance, or we've seen children as an opportunity for us to experiment. And I think both of those mentalities are very dangerous, and I think it's very important that we identify those and that we start moving away, and as you said, understand that when we speak about karma, it means that we are karmically responsible for the welfare of children. And not that children are somehow karmically responsible for what happens to them. That's definitely a very serious misapplication of our philosophy.
Misapplication, yeah. Thanks for that, Sharida. But the idea is kind of like the misconception, like children are Maya. Children are Maya, rather than children, and this opportunity to relate to the children. children are an opportunity for expanding Krishna consciousness. And so this children are my, it's taken some very shadowy, gross forms. And yeah, I appreciate how you reflected what I said about the karma. I know there's Guru Nasasyat, Svajano Nasasyat, Namochet, Yasamapita Mitrim, that like, no, like it's I'm responsible. For any child in the community, an adult's responsible to relate them in such a way that it supports their process of blissful self-realization. Thanks.
Thank you, Prabhu. I know that we covered about, the establishment of the CPO and certain perceptions and conceptualizations around children that we have within ISKCON, how that may or may not contribute towards, the continuous behaviors that are not very supportive or, quite frankly, positive towards children and child protection. But I just wanted to touch base on the impact of victim of on children, really, given your background in clinical counseling and the therapy and the work you did, not just with the CPO but also in your personal capacity. What kind of long-term psychological consequences have you seen these victims facing later on in their lives?
Okay. Yeah, it's like I could talk about that from a clinical sterile point of view, and it's difficult because oftentimes, not always, like sometimes a youth will, through whatever support they get, they'll put things in a compartment and they actually resolve it, and they even relate to the maltreatment they experienced in a way that makes them a stronger, healthier individual. So, so like everyone responds in different ways, but I've certainly seen long-term effects that are very heart-wrenching and devastating. I mean, okay, commonly it could be just like ongoing into adulthood, just terrible anxiety, debilitating depression, a sense of self-worth that's crushed. That's just a crushed sense of self-worth, which of course can prevent one from shining and contributing with their full Krishna-given gifts to society and to life. So on all levels, in some cases, results of sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional, some cases, it leads to suicide. It leads to, or even if not suicide, but they're so physically injured from the maltreatment. And this is definitely true with lots of those who experienced abuse in ISKCON, physical and sexual and emotional, that they'll just live a lot less long because they're so physically traumatized. So very real, terrible stuff. And I'll comment. So like I mentioned, like there's emotional and psychological, physical, ongoing effects in many cases, not all. And then since we're talking about the ISKCON organization, like the spiritual effects, because in my experience, and this is confirmed by research, okay, so there's child maltreatment, by elders. Maybe it's an elder sibling, maybe it's an uncle, maybe it's a stranger. Okay, so that's devastating, and how that affects someone in terms of their sense of like, I'm all alone in this world. There's no one to protect me. This person's supposed to be my caregiver, and they violated me. So what that does. And then in an organization purported to be spiritual, that's even more severe, because the caregiver, it's not just an elder, it's supposed to be an authority, a dad, a mom, a teacher, but the representatives of the supreme personality, they're representatives of God, And so it's like the devastating effects of abuse within the kind of the spiritual community, or maybe in some cases, more appropriately, spiritual in quotes, in some cases. It can be even more devastating as far as going into adolescence and adult years, even more devastating with respect to just a sense of despair and hopelessness, and just the universe is meaningless and empty, because just the whole concept of the absolute and the supreme has been violated and transgressed through that child abuse. And I'll say that within that can take an even more severe form in like the ISKCON organization, because it's not just like a representative God, but in ISKCON, many of the abusers or those who have been actively covering up, concealing, it's not just even like representative God, but it's like they're non-different from God. It adds a whole nother layer of spiritual abuse, spiritual violation.
Thank you, Prabhu. I think that point around spiritual abuse is important, because I think that could then contribute towards that person's perception of faith, and their interpretation of their faith and the belief. Because often I read reports, the point you made about, often the abuse was conducted by those that they either, looked up as, elder boys, big brothers they looked up to, or people in positions of authority. So I think that point you raised about the impact on their spiritual growth and faith is quite important. And related to that, what have you seen in your work? Because I know you did a lot of work in the communities with communities before you took on CPO role, at community level in supporting those victims. So what have you seen that people wanting from ISKCON or from authorities, victims, what did they generally want so that they can help with the healing process, really?
Okay, well, if I'm working with an individual, like maybe a young adult who was maltreated within the organization or by someone connected with the organization, then usually I'm co-creating with them, moving towards consciousness of not needing or wanting anything from the organization. Okay, now I mean there's more parts to this, and I'll get to it, I think, but meaning like, yeah, cultivating a consciousness, not me imposing, but they realize that their process is about coming to a place where they're not, for their healing, for their fulfillment, for their reclaiming some sort of joy in life, that they're not in any way dependent that the organizational leadership will do this or that. So that's important. Okay. At the same time, we don't want like those in the organization, including in position of leadership, to misuse that. So okay, yeah, that it so much exacerbates the damage and the wound. I'll just say I really appreciate Damodar's comment here about apart from the usual impacts of abuse, devotee kids who've experienced abuse also have their relationship with Krishna consciousness deranged, smashed, crushed, not completely destroyed, because as terrible as this material viciousness is, Krishna consciousness is even more powerful. And I have so many stories where I've been so inspired by those who've been terribly crushed by abuse in the organization, and leaders in the organization furthering the abuse and encouraging it. But then, and even though they might have no contact with the organization, they have like a deep, they retain a deep love for Krishna and Prabhupada, which is amazing. It just shows how powerful, how spirit ultimately is superior to matter. So to really like to irritate the wounding even more is like, because of course there's money, there's like money, and there was lawsuits, and that could send a healthy message. It could also send a negative message. We can get into that whole discussion, but when you have not just those who perpetrated the maltreatment to children, but those who either knowingly or out of gross negligence covered up and concealed and encouraged the abuse, and they're and they're not just respected as top leaders, they're actually worshipped as non-different than God. That's just like spitting in the face of the children, the teens, the youth, the families. And as long as you have that going on, and I believe it's still rampant, I'm quite sure it's still rampant, then, we can talk about a culture of no tolerance, this and that. And then such talk is more punch in the gut. It's more spit in the face, because just like it would be better if you didn't talk. It would be better if you didn't talk, if you still got the child abusers and those who covered up for child abuse, um, worshipped as non-different from God, leadership positions. And then if you talk about how we're really reformed now, then it hurts even more. So if that consciousness, that culture could be eliminated and transformed, then that would make a big difference.
Thank you so much for sharing about your experience. I think in one of your papers, you wrote that research has shown that when victims of abuse see public consequences, for the abusers, then that also helps them to experience a sense of justice. I'm not saying everyone should be hung up or, publicly executed, but there needs to be some publicized sanctions, some clear form of punishment, and then that actually needs to be carried through consistently. So I think that's very important. I think there's a need for therapy, there's a need for healing, there's a need for finding ways to help the persons that have been victims of abuse to become wholesome individuals, because we know a lot of victims really struggle to be functioning adults. And there's also a need for institutional justice. And we've seen with recent cases of abuse where there was a lack for decades for real justice, that in other parts in the world, devotees that are now adults and they have their own families, they were absolutely outraged when this came out. And that just shows that even though they weren't personally affected anymore by the abuse, they weren't healed. And the fact that they haven't seen institutional justice has definitely contributed to, I think, re-traumatizing them. And as you pointed out, damaging or at least challenging their faith, which I think is something we have to account for. If you're a leader and you act in such ways that you are damaging people's faith, you are going to have to account for that. So I think that was some very important points you made. Now I wanted to move the discussion on particular to ISKCON schools and child protection, because we know historically, and I think speaking under correction, up till date, a lot of the abuse connected to ISKCON is more related to ISKCON schools. So what are institutional characteristics that facilitate abuse? So what if you, as a social worker, as someone that's extensively worked in this field, if you walked into a school, what things would stand out to you as signals as this is going to facilitate abuse?
Okay. Yeah. Well, of course, as we, if we look over the past 30 years, there's, in many parts of the world, again, I really don't have much connection with this kind of organization. I mean, I endeavored to serve Prabhupada's movement and to follow the sadhana Prabhupada gave us in many ways. But I really have very little connection with this kind of institution really for about 20 years. So I'm not necessarily up on things, but I do understand that in most parts of the world, the boarding schools have closed in ISKCON, because parents understandably didn't trust that system anymore, and then so they're creating other options. And then my understanding is, as far as the boarding schools in ISKCON, that's especially in India. And yeah, I mean, I left Child Protection Office in 2004. I left the service of director, but what I've heard since then is very, very concerning. It is very concerning. So that would be things like if there's this culture of fear and repression, let's call it a code of silence. Don't talk about that. Don't talk about that. I know when I started when we established the Child Protection Office in 1998, and at that time, sort of the conception was probably the worst and most extensive abuse in the organization had happened in the Vrindavan Gurukulu. But actually, pretty quickly, it became clear it was Mayapur. And so I went to Mayapur 4 years in a row, 99 through 2002. And a reason for that is because in Mayapur, there was a much thicker code of silence. And it wasn't just some psychological thing. I remember my 1999, someone agreed to talk to me. He was maybe he was maybe already in his early 30s. But he said, look, Dhira Govinda, if I were to start sharing with you what happened, then maybe tomorrow my mother is drowned in the Ganges. Okay? He was very serious. So this kind of code of silence, this kind of whole culture of fear and repression, which is the opposite of what Srila Goswami described as Guyam Akiti Prichati, a culture of relationship, a culture of community, where it's a safe place to reveal the mind and heart confidentially, and to inquire confidentially. So code of silence, structures where it's just like there's just like this ghoulish, scary isolation. We understand there could be boundaries, and boarding school means like you're not living with your parents. At the same time, research has clearly indicated, like, to the extent that parents are involved in the school, then there's less chance of abuse. Parents are involved. Actually, and some mothers for sure. And in fact, that when it's known the child has a strong connection with dad, much less chance the child will be abused, stuff like that. I remember when I'll talk about Mayapur. When I first visited Mayapur, I was in Mayapur in other capacities going back to the 1980s, but when I visited in the capacity of child protection, there was around the schools, around the community, like children would be walking around, and it would be like the brahmacharis, the adults would be patting them on the rear end, and just all this uninvited physical contact. And it was just like, ew, of course there's healthy physical affection, we understand that, but this was just like, ew, this was just like violation. I have a right to dominate your space. And it was just like amongst the rank and file, and just amongst the devotees. And so my sense is, because I went there that by 2002, we transformed that culture. I think within a few years it snapped back. But, so that sort of thing, just kind of like uninvited crossing of boundaries with the children. And then, so, and then, like if there's just this kind of repressive prevention of any contact with the outside, because they're karmis, they're in Maya, your parents are in Maya, you're that whole thing. Whereas no, there's actually healthy exchange with outside influence, healthy exchange of knowledge, of wisdom, of realization, and also if outsiders are allowed in some way, in some healthy ways, then it means like we're going to be more attentive, not to be doing some very sinister, shadowy stuff, because like people will people will be seen. People will see. So those are a few points. Those are a few points.
Thank you so much, Prabhu. So I think generally what you pointed out is that a school should not be too, you used this word in one of your articles, insulated, so that there is very little contact from the outside, very little input from the outside, and very little monitoring from the outside. And when a school is like that, it also prevents the children from being able to communicate with others outside of the structure, outside of the power structure, when their needs are not being met and when they are, experiencing maltreatment. So that was a big theme. Related to that, someone in the comments mentioned that they are thinking that the demonization of secular schooling might have also contributed, to this issue, because I think we've seen sometimes that even though parents might be aware that there's issues at a school and know that there's been abuse at the school, they'll still send the child to the school because they'll argue that it's a Gurukulu, and the Gurukulu, is definitely better than sending my child to a mainstream school. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, yeah. So my emphasis there, I mean, it's an important, valid point. Yeah, my emphasis there is that for parents to accept 100% responsibility for their children, protection and education. Okay, 100% responsibility. In some cases, it might look like sending them thousands of miles away to an ISKCON Gurukul. It could look like that. But I would caution against the mentality of, oh, it's an organizational school. So no, the parents respond. I remember talking to a few who were parents of children like back in the 70s, and their children were maltreated. Their children were maltreated in the ISKCON school, and these parents told me, they all told me that they knew that Prabhupada, would not want the parents to go against their own intuition. That if the parents didn't trust a teacher or a leader in the school, that Prabhupada wouldn't in any way force them to send their children there. So Prabhupada wants all his followers to be independently thoughtful, so that for parents to be educated through podcasts like this and through other things. There's book chapters. I've written some, others have written some, lots of articles. Parents be educated and make informed decision, and for parents not to give away their power of responsibility for protecting their children. Any institution. I'm not saying don't send your children to an institutional school. I'm saying parents are responsible. And yeah, for sure, as this question has, many amongst the institution in leadership positions, in educational leadership positions in the organization, yeah, that they've developed different twisted things about like, yeah, only schools that we run are healthy, and like at the expense of and then that just kind of shuts down, and then many of the members of the movement, then they feel intimidated. Oh, well, he's a senior devotee, he's my guru, he's my mentor, and he says send my child to this school here. Well, I'm just emphasizing parents be responsible, and that might mean you choose to keep your children away from the public schools. It might mean you choose to send your children to public schools, and you're consciously responsible to give them a Vaishnava education within the household. It could look so many forms.
Thank you so much, Prabhu. I think that's an essential point, and that is that parents need to play a key role in protecting their children, taking responsibility for their children. And I think parents need to trust their intuition. And I think, in addition, I'd like to say, as a teacher, I have worked in Mayapur, in the international school, and I've also worked in the UK in the Avanti schools. I've seen, many devotee children grow up, and my personal observation is that the main determining factor whether children, become inspired devotees is their parents. It's not the school that they go to. I've seen, children become very serious about Krishna consciousness who have been homeschooled, who've gone to Gurukulu, who's gone to public school, who's gone to international schools. And I've also seen children, develop an aversion for Krishna consciousness in all those scenarios. So I think one big shift we need to make is that the determining factor, in your child's life when it comes to Krishna consciousness is the school, which you're going to send them to. Because I think that is misunderstanding where the responsibility, for the child lies, thinking it lies predominantly, with the school. And I think you have to understand that a school's primary function is just going to be, education, but it's not going to be cultivating, your child spirituality. So I think that is for me personally, I think that's a very important shift we need to make in ISKCON. I understand people's concern about sending their child to public school, but I've seen so many devotee children coming from strong devotee families going to public school, and while even going through secondary school, remaining very inspired in their Krishna consciousness, following principles, getting initiated at a young age, staying involved with the temple. So that is possible if you as a parent take that responsibility on.
Thanks for that. Yeah, and I would say I wouldn't even say that the parents are a key factor. The parents are the key factor, the main key factor, and the parents accept 100% responsibility for the protection and the education of their children, and whatever choice they make. And just backtracking a bit, because we talked about we talk about things that are like red flags and the code of silence and the insulation, and just like, and I would say like another thing is just complete craziness. For example, okay, so maybe you read my red flag series of articles. Okay, maybe you read my red flag. So just as an example, so even though I left the director service of Child Protection Office in 2004, as people would still write to me because they would have child protection concerns and they thought I might be able to help in some way. So I remember in 2010, I got a letter that directed me to some of what was going on in Mayapur at that time. Okay. And it was very, very concerning because what it sounded like, the same sort of culture, the same sort of abuse is happening. And of course, 13 years later, it was happening. That's clear. But so I wrote to the International Child Protection Director of the time, 2010, of the ISKCON Office of Child Protection. And anyhow, in exchange of correspondence, so the director of the child protection team in Mayapur, he said at that time about the accusations happening at that time, because there was a special concern, especially considering the history of what happened in Mayapur. So he said, the history of what happened in Mayapur, it was just some boys playing, boys play. Now, just for maybe some viewers aren't aware, it was years and years of ongoing, with dozens and dozens of children, violent, brutal abuse that was denied and covered up and then exposed, and then trying to cover up the revelations. Okay, so this was just egregious, severe, brutal abuse. And so the director of the child protection team said it was just, boys playing. Okay. So it's like the same, it was like already like the 5th or 6th iteration. I wrote to the international director of the ISKCON Child Protection Office. And I said, look, based on what I'm hearing from Mayapur, that the child protection director said it's just boys playing, I'm concerned, especially considering the history of the extensive child maltreatment in ISKCON Mayapur. So she wrote back, she responded, history of child abuse in Mayapur? What history of child abuse in Mayapur? So sometimes I just don't even know how to respond. I'm just dumbfounded. So I said, like, well, wasn't that part of your training? I remember after I said I wrote an article called A Festival of Red Flags. I remember after I wrote that article, a few days later, I went to the Sunday feast at the local program here. And one of the Prabhus, he came to me and said, I saw your article. Her response, history of child abuse? He said, that would be if, like, this was 2010, right around the time of the big oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. He said it would be like if the new CEO of BP Oil said, oil spill in the Gulf? What oil spill in the Gulf? So what I'm saying is, like, if a parents inform themselves, you got this egregious abuse. I mean, like if it went to like a court in a country with a justice system where that would be processed. I mean, just like so many people, including those in leadership positions, including those who were worshipped as non-different from God in this kind of, they'd spend lots of years in prison. Okay. I mean, this is just gross, violent criminal stuff. And a parent can easily find this and see, and the current director of child protection, locally and internationally, it was just boys' place. So, like, you don't need to be like a big sociological scholar to go, like, this is lunacy. This is lunacy. I'm not letting my children get anywhere near there. So I'll just put that craziness factor out there.
Thank you so much, Prabhu. I think 3 points I got from that is one, there is the tendency to minimize child abuse cases and to whitewash, what has happened extensively. And when we do so, we can't really address it. And then I think another point is choosing to be ignorant. Choosing not to be informed. And I think, again, if you choose not to be informed, you are still going to be, held accountable for your failure to act. And I think the last thing that you mentioned, and it does tie in with a point that we got from Robert from YouTube, is, sometimes we can all see that, behavior is completely inconsistent with our philosophy, completely inconsistent with just basic morality. But still, we somehow, in very creative ways, rationalize and justify it. And I think that is problematic. We need to, I think, be conscious of not, yielding our healthy, independent thinking. Our independent reasoning. Like, if something looks morally off, it is because it probably is. And I think we have to understand that just because someone is, in our regard, a elevated devotee, a great speaker, a charismatic leader, does not mean that they could not perpetuate horrible child abuse. I think it's very important, though it's extremely uncomfortable, sitting with that. Someone could have done years of service, but at the same time, they could have abused a child, and then we can't deny that. So I think that is also very key. I wanted to ask if you could just briefly comment on what would be proactive strategies, systems that a school should have in place to minimize the chances of abuse. Because we know in the material world, there's always going to be a risk of abuse.
Yeah.
But what can be proactively done to minimize the chances?
Well, I think in some sense in the past hour, we've addressed some of that when we talked about, like, the consciousness, because sure, we can talk about structures and should be like, like structures, for example, it's especially in the boarding schools, but also in other places, education, education for the children, education for the parents, education for the teachers, screening of the teachers, screening of the administrators, and it can be challenging because oftentimes those who will maltreat children, oftentimes they're very smooth actors, they're very intelligent, sometimes they're good communicators, sometimes like this is just the sort of person we want to have in our organization. So like it requires a lot of subtle distinctions, to do effective screening. And and so there's and the screening, the education of community members, and things like let's say if a child or a teen, let's say they have a music lesson with a particular music teacher, or they're learning sports, just like whenever there's one-on-one, whenever there's one-on-one, then there's that possibility of an emotional, affectionate bond. So kind of like, we can look at the rule of threes that either eliminate or minimize the one-on-one, or if there is a one-on-one, unavoidably because of the architecture, the doors are open. There's basic precautions, basic precautions, even related to architecture, and looking at where might the child be developing an emotional bond with someone who, might have some ill motivations after they gain the child's trust. And this relates, this the consciousness, how much service someone has done. Because again, because like, if in the organization, if in the institution, if those who turned a blind eye to abuse, if those who are getting profit, adoration, and distinction by protecting the abusers, if those who are feeding children to the abusers, if the abusers themselves, if they're regarded as godlike authorities, so that's a code of like, don't dare even question anything like that. You can't allow yourself to think in that direction. Then we can put up this structure or that structure, but then you've got this very dark cult-like consciousness in the institution. And I'm using cult-like in a pejorative way. Srila Prabhupada sometimes used, like he said, the cult of Krishna consciousness in a very positive way, but I'm using it in a pejorative way. And so, or like, we talked about misuse of the sublime philosophical principle and active principle of karma, misunderstanding, misuse of apichat siracharo bhajante mam ananya bhak sarareva samyak bhavi hito hisa. Like, because the idea is like, okay, so even if we consider someone as saintly, I mean, that could be a whole step, but even, okay, so maybe we should consider someone as saintly and make sure that he spends time in prison. There's no contradiction there. And of course, I was recently reading a transcribed Bhagavatam lecture from Srila Prabhupada, and he was referencing this verse, apichat suduracharo. He was referencing it in the context of, he was speaking in India, and he was talking about, his Western-bodied students. And I said, like, and sometimes, like, after they take prasad, they don't wash their hands. Like, it's just not their culture. So, yeah, right. So they, they have their shortcomings, but we shouldn't criticize them because they're sincere on the path. So Prabhupada's one thing, he's not talking about, they are serial rapists of children. So of course they should be leading kirtans at the festivals. They're not so cultured to wash their hands, but let's not criticize them, just to put things in perspective. But even if someone is like, did commit egregious child abuse, and someone thinks, but now they're well situated. Okay, so that's one conversation, and that's a different conversation that for the integrity of Prabhupada's movement, for the protection of children, for the optics, does it really make sense that they're going to be in leadership positions? Because devotional services, ahetukya pratyataya yatma suprasidati, like in any child protection office restriction, we're never saying someone shouldn't do service. No, we encourage everyone, even the most severe, terrible child abuser, chant Hare Krishna. There's unlimited ways to do service, but like what's this attachment? Not just from the one who committed the abuse, but from their friends. What's this attachment that they remain in positions of higher authority? Worship is non different from God. Then that just gets like, this is gross, you know.
Thank you so much for sharing, Prabhu. I think you did highlight that it is important to have certain policies in practice. For instance, screening of teachers, etc., and also having rules. We definitely have this, standard rule in I think many public schools is that you're not allowed to be alone with a child, as an adult.
Yeah.
If you need to speak briefly alone to a child, the door needs to be open. So there's all these practical arrangements that just makes it more difficult, for predatory people to take advantage of children. But I think the main thing that you highlighted again, it is a change in consciousness that is required. That needs to facilitate a change in culture. And I think one thing which you highlighted in particular is even if we still want to regard someone as spiritually significant, we can still hold them morally accountable.
Yes.
And I think the idea that forgiveness and punishment are not mutually exclusive. And I think lastly, a very important point which you brought out is that we need to address in ourselves why we have the tendency to want to keep certain people in positions of authority and power. Not power in terms of management, but power in terms of we've given them the highest position someone can receive in ISKCON when it comes to spiritual authority. You are Diksha Guru, you are Shiksha Guru. And why do we want to keep people there when there's evidence that they have done things which have clearly, disqualified them from that service? So I think that's a question, we need to ask ourselves.
I appreciate that point, and it points to another aspect of consciousness, because in our time here, we talk a lot about consciousness of those in leadership positions. But then amongst what's called the collective devotees who might not have a leadership position, but and I've encountered this consistently since 1998. When we established Child Protection Office, because like it would be pretty common, like people would be just like, yes, there no tolerance for child abuse in the organization, and I'm determined to take a stand and this and that. Okay. And then when it turns out like, okay, so if we apply this rigorous approach to a common sense, rigorous approach to eliminate, to not have child abusers in position or those who covered up. Okay, and then when it turns out that, well, if we actually apply this down the line, then perhaps that particular Prabhu or Mataji's, maybe their particular dear mentor, maybe the guru, well, who they maybe assumed, of course, my mentor is the one who surely stood courageously and bravely against all odds for principle and truth and integrity. And it turned like if we just apply reality, well, no, actually, at best, maybe your dear mentor was part of the cover-up or the concealment or pretending not to know because he or she got some perks for continuing to feed children there. Then we find that enthusiastic determination, no tolerance for child abuse, it becomes a tepid Never mind. Actually, it's not even my service to get involved in this.
Mm.
So this is very, very serious, because it's not just the consciousness of those in leadership positions. It's the consciousness of the collective devotees. And I'm trying to highlight one aspect of it that stymies, that really blocks inspired, determined, courageous effort.
Yeah, I think we need to start asking ourselves, where is this need to idealize certain people at any cost coming from? I think that's an important question we need to ask.
I agree. I agree.
Sorry, I think the points we talked about, I think was very interesting, because I work in a policy context for the Department of Education for the UK, for England, so to speak. So these points around child protection, and if you look at from a secular perspective, some of these things we talked about screening people, and if somebody was convicted, and not letting them be near, work with children again, is sounds like a no brainer, basic child protection principles. But we see in the instances that we talked about, where these kind of things were often overlooked or neglected, or boys playing with boys, people in positions of authority not being trained, or being
Yeah.
told. The 1999 report, I read, it was quite harrowing, to be honest, to read. It was not very pleasant to read. And for some people that were then in present times in authoritative positions in those circumstances, not being told that this report existed,
Yeah.
feels like a systemic failure in terms of as an institution. And I see lots of comments around about, from devotees in the chat around, whether we send kids to secular schools or faith schools. I think it all depends. There's no black or white. It all depends on some of the protection issues that we spoke about earlier. But I wanted to probably move very quickly around the issue about that accountability and the GBC's response, because we touched upon there's been this whitewashing, and these influential friends covering up for their influential friends, and people, some people often, I'm not going to admit names or go into individual cases, people even after them admitting themselves, having written accounts of the abuser, admitting abuse, people still reluctant to take them from those positions of authority. So what do you think has led to GBC often justifying or standing by these perpetrators, where these kind of issues are sort of overlooked, and it's just like a bit of fall down, they've done a lot of services, so let them crack on almost attitude? Why do you think it has led to this somewhat justification and standing by perpetrators?
Well, I remember when this was maybe this was a while ago. This was maybe 22 years ago, and yes, that I remember I was at a GBC meeting. This wasn't the plenary session, but I was with a few GBC gurus like that, and we were talking about. I was there in my capacity as director of the Child Protection Office. Yeah, and we're talking about processing the case of a particular high-profile case of alleged, but actually already confirmed child maltreatment, quite extensive. And we were just talking about, and then one of the GBC's present said, but 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 do you know how many disciples he has? Meaning, like, how could you process his case? Do you know how many disciples he has? It would be crushing for the disciples. Do you know what that would mean for the financial income of the temples where his disciples are? Have you considered that, Dhira Govinda Das? So this was regular. And again, that's like another one of those times where I'm left speechless, kind of like, what? How does that matter? And again, I was never out to get anyone. Okay, but just like, yeah, whether this person has this profile or this person's congregation member, pot washer, but just like I couldn't conceive how the number of disciples someone has or what that represents in terms of income to the temples, how that ought to make any sort of difference whatsoever in processing justice. And they, not all, but many of them, they were they couldn't conceive how I couldn't conceive how that was really important. So again, as long as we have that consciousness amongst persons in leadership positions and amongst the collective members of the institution who support persons in that consciousness and leadership positions, then we can do this structure or that structure, but that'll be somewhat superfluous. That'll be somewhat superfluous. And along with it, let's say my sense or my clear perception is like, well, if we process the case on this one, then, well, he knows stuff about us. I certainly would not want him to start revealing. So it becomes, what's it called? The old boys club, a form of nepotism. That sort of pretty common in organizations. At the same time, if we're talking about the depth and the extent of brutal harm done to children, it's not just like an organization that you might find in business or education, but like it's looking very, very mafia like.
So, Prabhu, you touched upon, some of these arguments against, or, the reluctance of authorities or influential people within GBC and ISKCON to deal with these things and remove people that are convicted or admitted to committing these offenses from those authorities of power was the influence they have, the number of disciples, the amount of, donations they might bring. But actually, have they actually considered the impact, the kind, if you flip the table, flip the coin, so to speak, what impact would it have on the devotee community, when these things get out, the fact that there are people in positions, so they're thinking about a money, because we've seen this with the Catholic Church, right?
Yeah,
The Catholic Church had I don't know whether people would know, in terms of history, went through a period of covering up,
yeah,
abuse, because to save that institution, to save the prestige. And actually, in England, the census was done, and for the first time in history, people that identified them as Christian declined. So Christianity, in a predominantly Christian country, the census revealed that people no longer class them as Christian or belonging to a religion, because generations of individuals, particularly in, impacted groups or pockets of groups, just became very, very disengaged with religion altogether. So what kind of perverse attitudes or perverse reactions are we expecting by saying, oh, these people have lots of influence, so let's not touch this issue with a barge pole because it's going to upset the apple cart?
it's very short-sighted. It's very short-sighted, focusing on the prayas rather than the shreyas. And I think what you described, the Catholic Church dynamic, I think that's happening with ISKCON now, because now there was and is so much cover up and concealment of the cover up and deception and threats around the bluff, around the child maltreatment, generations after generations, so much harm done to children. Okay, in order to protect the movement, so called, but then as that's coming out so much in social media now, podcasts like this, then so many hundreds and thousands and maybe tens of then their trust in the leadership of the institution is so eroded, and they just feel so disgusted, and so that's happening, that very short-sighted, unethical, immoral, unprincipled strategy. It's it's very foolish. There's no wisdom there.
I know you've done a lot of work, Prabhu, around communities and supporting, in your work with the Statov Institute and what have you. So, what impact have you seen within devotee communities of, this neglect, apart from the general, obviously, the idea of quite frankly discussed, and the lack of common sense. Have you seen any other specific impact around, the response from the authorities?
Yeah, the response or lack
Yeah.
of response. Yeah, yeah. Well, in generally, I would say some maybe many just become kind of like disgusted about having any connection with the organization, or if they do have some connection, like very very guarded, and then for some, unfortunately, maybe they do some version of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and they give up the actual process of Krishna consciousness. That's sad, in my opinion. In many cases, I see more and more, in response to this kind of a healthy empowerment to, like, I'm going to practice Krishna consciousness and serve Prabhupada's movement separate from this corrupt organization. I see that happening worldwide more and more.
That's very interesting. Thank you, Prabhu, for shedding light on, the potential impacts and those actually, most importantly, the unintended consequences of, not acting properly, because if it was a normal context of education or institutions, if somebody had a criminal record, people struggle to get a normal day job, and there's people with potentially criminal records who should frankly, if investigated, be in prison, being held in positions of power, and being upheld as, saintly individuals, which is very sad. Sharadia, I think you wanted to move us on to another little section of the conversation.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one comment, and that is that I do have, some level of probably just sympathy, for the GBC and trying to manage this, and maybe sincerely thinking, that covering up, was the right action at the time. But I think, it's severely undermined their authority, and it's severely, undermined trust. And I think what is also happening at the moment, which is a I think unforeseen and unfortunate consequence, is that in order for anyone to still have complete faith and trust, they need to be blindly following. So I'm seeing increasingly that certain leaders are encouraging, their disciples or their followers, like, don't read outside, don't talk to other people, don't believe this. And this is creating, very unhealthy, cultish like, behavior and, and groups. And then I've also seen, leaders speaking about individuals who have now officially, been found guilty of severe child abuse. And I've seen other leaders severely downplaying it and, arguing this person's case, trying, for us to have empathy. And I think, again, that's a very cultish like behavior. So I think this is a very unfortunate side effect where you cannot address issues openly, justly. Then, you asking either of your members, as you rightly pointed out, to have that rude awakening and say, I will no longer be part of this, or to, basically give up, their independent thinking, give up their sense of morality, and, just follow blindly. And that's definitely not what Srila Prabhupada wanted. And we know that if people start acting in that way, like, if you kind of have this, we see this with, with revolutions, we get this kind of mass hysteria where the masses then also, start acting in very irresponsible ways. So obviously we haven't gotten to that point yet, but I do think this is something for ISKCON leaders to, to very, very seriously consider, and consider what are the long-term, effects, of us continuing, to sweep things underneath the carpet.
Yeah, these are very valid points that you're making, Saradia. Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, very, very valid points. And I started this conversation hour and a half ago by commending the GBC. They did an excellent service for Srila Prabhupada's movement and the world by creating the Child Protection Task Force, who did an excellent job back in 1997. And then the GBC took it a step further, and they accepted the Child Protection Task Force report, and GBC took it further, and they actually funded the office, at least for the first few years. I know now there's hardly any funding. So the GBC did wonderfully. I said professionals from outside the devotee community, from the legal profession, from social work, from therapy profession. They commended ISKCON organization for creating this structure for child protection. They said this is a great example for the world to follow for international organizations. So the GBC should be commended. And then, like in a recent high-profile case, but then they're refusing to follow their own structures because so much attachment to this culture of darkness and repression and twisted corruption. There's such a tangled web that they're just adamantly defying their own structures. That creates just a common sense, responsible, reasonably intelligent people are just I don't want anything to do with this organization. And and at the same time, such persons might naturally be enthusiastic to serve Prabhupada and practice Krishna consciousness, but not in connection with the organization.
Thank you so much, Prabhu. One last question I have before we move on to some questions from our viewers is, we've spoken a lot about the significant change in consciousness and then culture which we need. Now, what I've very often heard from several devotees when I speak about child abuse, or even not when I speak to them about it, when they see that I publicly speak about child abuse, is they tell me that they don't want to even think about child abuse. They don't read anything about child abuse in ISKCON because it's not their service and it disturbs their Krishna consciousness when they found out about these things. So can you share with us why it is essential that each member of ISKCON considers at least child protection as part of their responsibilities, something that they at least should be aware of? Why is this so important?
Well, Srila Prabhupada emphasized child protection. So every member of Prabhupada's movement, sure, there might be very few who kind of make it part of their service. I'm going to be an advocate or something like that. So at the same time, it's one thing that it's not my service to be an advocate or to be on the front lines. At the same time, Krishna consciousness means we're conscious, means we're not burying our head in the sand. And here's the thing: if we're dedicated to ignorance, then we're probably making ourselves susceptible to be political pawns of those who are intent to perpetuate the culture of abuse. Okay, because it might be I just don't want to hear about it. All I know is I'm just going to send my child to that school there. Or all I know is I'm going to worship this person here, and maybe we're worshiping someone who just raped a child. And again, I'm not trying to be overly dramatic. These are real case scenarios, right? These are real case scenarios in the organization. So it's not it'll be very few person service to make this my main service in child protection, something like that. But I do think it's any kind of conscious member of Prabhupada's movement, and we're really a member of the movement, then it means we're conscious to at least be informed, to at least be informed, and then make conscious, informed decisions about where I give my energies, how I direct my children, where I offer my obeisances, where I give my donations. Let's be conscious. Otherwise, look, this whole sort of I'm going to bury my head in the sand and pretend I'm transcendental. Thank you very much. I'm not impressed.
Thank you so much, Prabhu. I think, as you rightly pointed out, being Krishna consciousness begins with being conscious, and, being in denial, is the opposite of that. And not all of us have the same level of capacity or responsibility, but I think all of us at least should consider that children's welfare, it is to some extent or the other also our responsibility, because I think we need to consider that the society as a whole is like an ecosystem, and if a person in that ecosystem is being harmed, it's going to affect you, one way or the other. Even if you need to think about it from that selfish point of view, you've got to understand a child suffering is going to impact you in the long term, some way or the other. And I think last thing I'll say is that I don't have children myself. I work in education, so I'm obviously concerned about children. But I've shared with you before, I often think that we should ask ourselves, if Srila Prabhupada showed up at my house tonight and he asked me, what have you done for the children of my movement? Are you going to be able to wholeheartedly say, I've done everything I could? And that's going to look different for each individual. But could you honestly say, Prabhupada, I've tried? Or you're going to have to say, Prabhupada, I turned a blind eye.
It's a very, very touching question. A very touching question. And I see it's you're emotionally moved in being in that question.
Thinking about it, yeah.
Yeah, it's a beautiful question, and it's a question we ought to live in. And for each of us, the responses might be different. At the same time, it's such a vital question. The children in Prabhupada's movement are so dear to Srila Prabhupada, and they are being harmed. Of course, that's going to happen even in the best of societies. But yeah, there's no excuse anymore for any members of Prabhupada movement to say, "Oh, that was in the past. That doesn't happen anymore." No. There's been we're on like about the 12th iteration of, "Oh, that was in the past," and then the next week it gets revealed, "Oh no, it's actually happening right now under my nose." 2 years later, "No, that was in the past." No, it's like it's our responsibility to be informed, to participate in the protection of Srila Prabhupada's children. And for each of us, the participation might look different. And I like Chaitanya Mangala's naturally reinforcing that it's everyone's responsibility to protect children. Thanks for that. It's 100% the parents' responsibility. It's 100% the leader. Everyone's 100% responsible. I resonate with that. I know Srila Prabhupada resonates with that.
Thank you, Prabhu. Quickly, I'm conscious of the time, but we've had a lot of engagement from viewers today, and we do want to pick up some questions because I think they would add very much value to the kind of discussions that we've just been having. So, one thing that you just touched upon is that idea of collective denial, and that's something that Abhay Kurana has asked. It seems like individual slash collective denial is a real obstacle in all of this. Often the denial is well intentioned. We said that GBC have, to give credit, they tried, they set up task forces, then there were it's not that the GBC is not done anything, but it's that inconsistency in actually implementing that their own policies in instances, said, per person who's done XYZ should not be allowed to do XYZ, then just turn a blind eye and let people crack on as usual. So I think the inconsistency is that, it's this idea of sometimes denial. So his question is really, what are helpful ways to challenge that denial while minimizing harm? Is that even possible?
Okay.
To just speak the plain truth, or let whatever cost it play out?
Thank you, Abhay Karan, Hare Krishna. I'm reminded of the saying by Mark Twain, it's easier to fool people than to convince them that they've been fooled. So I think that's relevant here, because this denial is kind of like, if I come out of denial, then I need to kind of admit, it's embarrassing to admit that I've been fooled by this leader or this group or this mentor. And maybe that mentor has helped me in so many amazing ways. And in this area, I've allowed myself to be fooled. And that's embarrassing. So I'm like invested in not admitting that I've been fooled. So that's a psychology there. And then related to what Abai shares and asks, I'm reminded of Bhagavad Gita, chapter 17, text 15. It's about communication in the mode of goodness. Anudbega kram vakyam satyapriya hita hinam. And so it talks about, so like in the name of being silent, not to rock the boat, then we allow more harm to go on. At the same time, it's true, related to my understanding what Abai sharing, that should, like, when we choose to communicate to help someone to wake up, of course, that starts with where are my blind spots? Let me be sincere about waking myself up. Let's not just point the finger. So, but when we choose, like, it's one thing to choose silence out of choice. It's another thing to be silent because I'm too scared to speak, because what will people think of me? Like in a cowardly way. But when we, it says in that verse in Bhagavad Gita that austerity of speech, sattvic speech, it's true and it's beneficial. So that when I do choose to communicate the truth, which might be an uncomfortable, unpleasant truth, am I to what extent am I really choosing to communicate in a way where I know I'm doing my best with super soul guidance to communicate in a way where the person really gets my care? I'm not just trying to destroy your world and cause you pain and shame, but yeah, there are some things I'd like you to see, and I'm sharing and I'm pointing it out, and maybe there's some things you'd like me to see, and I'm doing it in a way. Well, we can think of like Srila Prabhupada as the example. He could be so heavy even in the first meeting. At the same time, because everyone got his purity, even though it might be very uncomfortable, they might not agree or whatever, but they wouldn't take offense at him because he could communicate like the boldest, most uncomfortable truths in a way that they got his purity. So we don't want to imitate Prabhupada. At the same time, we can aspire to follow that. We're ready to boldly, courageously speak truth in a way where we're truly coming from a caring, considerate, empathic place. That's like that growth edge balance.
Thank you, bro. I think that point about, coming from a caring, emphatic place is the most important thing, because some people often see people raising these issues about child protection or anything as, the upsetters of the apple cart. These people just want to cause trouble. But then that comes from, well, why you're raising those issues. If your ultimate motive is to preserve Prabhupada's movement for future generations, to stand by those principles Prabhupada stood by, I think then that intention, it's where the intention is, isn't it? It's if somebody's doing it from the attitude of I'm doing it better than this, and then of course there's a problem in that. But I think we need to also be conscious of challenging these things where we see it, but also challenging those in the proper, respectful way without antagonizing individuals. I think that's very, very important. I just wanted to pick up something very quickly, another question as well from Kesh Madhav Prabhu. He says it seems that one part of the issue is leaving the legal authorities out of it. What is your stance on getting legal authorities involved or advising parents to do so?
Yeah, well, I know in my time in child protection office, or even back in the 90s and early 2000s when I was serving in child protection areas with the state of Florida, but talking about ISKCON, we would always encourage, advise everyone, parents, leaders, temple authorities, to learn your local laws about child protection and child protection reporting. So to be conscious, to be conscious, to know what are the laws. And so so we we don't want to leave. I mean, there's some nuance in this discussion. So like if there's reasonable cause to suspect that a child's being maltreated, then probably we should involve the legal authorities. Okay. Some might criticize me. Why did you say probably? Well, I said probably because I've been in the real world in this area for decades, in some sense, for like more than 40 years. And so, but if there's reasonable cause to suspect, doesn't mean like, you mean if you know for sure that a child's being abused, then no, if there's reasonable cause to suspect, which might be the 5-10% threshold. Now, in some cases, in my experience, my experience is a very, very nice letter from Prabhupada. Yes, wonderful letter. Srila Prabhupada, he has letters to disciples where he's telling the disciples, don't force the children to chant japa. Childhood is for playing, and if they're playing, they get a sweet taste, and naturally they'll be inspired to chant japa and read Srimad Bhagavatam. If you force them, they'll rebel. Basic psychology that obviously Prabhupada was familiar with, but unfortunately he needed to explain it to some. So so in some cases I've seen, like in my services with the state of Florida back a while ago, so sometimes if someone would reactively automatically call authorities, legal or social service authorities, sometimes it could create more of a mess, right? So it's not like just like an automatic thing, but as a general principle, we don't want to be cultish in the negative sense. We don't want to be cultish in the negative sense of like, no, we handle everything internal, as Keshe Madhava's comments indicate, that cause so much pain, torment, suffering. So let's learn and follow our local laws about what constitutes child maltreatment, child protection, child reporting, and let's serve in cooperation with state, social service, legal authorities, conscious cooperation, definitely.
Thank you, Prabhu. That was very helpful. One other point I wanted to pick up was from Damodar Das Prabhu. Thank you for engaging uh, very in a very very helpful way, Damodar Prabhu. As usual, I know this topic is a very issue that's very close to your heart. He says that child abuse is horrific whenever and wherever it takes place, but in Prabhupada's movement, how can we get our heads around the levels of prevalence and inadequate response from the society's leadership? How to square any of this with a healthy Vaishnava culture? And I really wanted to emphasize on the point around healthy Vaishnava culture, because it's very easy to get very animated on every side and make it very ugly often. But how do we square this with a healthy Vaishnava culture?
Well, it's a symptom of gross deviation from healthy Vaishnav culture. So let's not confuse it with Vaishnav culture. It's simply, we talk about consciousness. So there's a consciousness that's the opposite of Vaishnav culture, that's led to this egregious prevalence and the inadequate responses. There's nothing Vaishnav about it. I'm reminded in this, and this is a story maybe some viewers have heard me tell, or I've written about it sometime. But yeah, and it just 2 days ago, I talked to a Vaishnav youth who's now in his 40s, and he was talking about, he recently had conversations with other Vaishnav youth who are kind of older than him, like maybe the first Vaishnav youth who came to the movement in the late 60s, early 70s. And it was like the distinction of what they experienced from Prabhupada and then from many who were in the leadership positions. So one story I tell, it was in my early days in the Child Protection Office there in 1998. And I did an interview right there in the Child Protection Office in person. And it was, it was a young man, and maybe he was about 30 years old at the time when I talked to him, 98. And he said that, okay, when his mother joined the Hare Krishna movement, he was maybe 7, 8 years old, and she joined in a big American city, and this was maybe 1976, and she sent him to Vrindavan. I think this is relevant to what Damodar. She sent him to the Vrindavan Gurukulu, And he said he's like, whatever, 8 years old. Of course, he feels homesick, and he's thousands of miles away. So, of course, it was difficult. But he said the Vrindavan Gurukul, it was a very sweet experience, very sweet, the Vrindavan Gurukul, the persons, and of course the Vrindavan, the Krishna consciousness. And then he shared that the headmaster was Dr. Sharma. Now, Dr. Sharma was appointed by Srila Prabhupada to be the headmaster. Dr. Sharma was an elderly Indian gentleman who served for decades in the India school system as like a headmaster, as an educator. My understanding is Dr. Sharma, he wasn't even a disciple of Srila Prabhupada. Actually, I don't even know if Dr. Sharma was a Vaishnav. But Srila Prabhupada appointed him. And this 30-year-old, who was 8 years old there in 1976, 77, he said that sometimes Dr. Sharma would slap the boys. And he said that when the boys got slapped by Dr. Sharma, they knew that they deserved it. They felt his warmth, love, and affection. I'm not saying I condone slapping. I never slapped my children, okay? But I'm just sharing. He said, like, when Dr. Sharma slapped us, we knew we deserved it. We felt his love. Okay, so then he described in the interview in 1998, the Srila Prabhupada disappearance pastime, November 1977, and described a few weeks later, a regime came into the Vrindavan Gurukul. He gave names. I'm not going to give names here. A regime came, and they kicked out Dr. Sharma and Dr. Sharma's assistants, and they put in new people. New people. And then this boy said, from that day on, my childhood became a nightmare. And then he talked about the sadistic abuse, this and that. So, in other words, like it wasn't just like a shift of personnel. No, it was a shift of consciousness from Vaikuntha to hellish lower planet stuff. And so that prevalence and the rampant cover up and the cover up of the cover up, that's not Vaishnav culture. That's something else altogether.
Thank you so much, Prabhu. I think we've had a very interesting and thought-provoking discussion. We appreciate your time with us. And I think this last anecdote that you shared was valuable in the sense that it did also show that we're not saying that every child that went to Gurukul always faced abuse and only had traumatic experiences. We do acknowledge that some children who went to Gurukul never experienced abuse. Yeah. And even those who did experience abuse also may have good memories of of Gurukul, of certain teachers. So we're not trying to discredit every Gurukul and every Gurukul teacher that has been there. At the same time, as we've stressed in our discussion tonight multiple times, it is absolutely imperative that we acknowledge the extent of the abuse, the abusers, and we start dealing with this problem. And I just wanted to add that we are also planning to have another discussion with my friend Abhidaya from the Bhakti Kids Sangha in 2 weeks' time. And then we are going to focus specifically on what we can do in ISKCON proactively to make ISKCON more child-friendly. So this was a rather heavy topic to deal with, and we had to focus on the dark side of especially the schools in ISKCON. But we just wanted to share that we do plan to also talk about what we can do to bring about that shift in consciousness and that shift in culture that has come up as a major theme. So we want to thank everyone that joined and that listened to the discussion. Please feel free to leave more comments below. Please also do share this conversation. We really want more devotees in ISKCON to be aware of this issue and to also feel that this is their issue that they can and should help to solve. So Prabhu, is there any closing remarks that you'd like to make before we greet everyone?
Hare Krishna, thank you for inviting me to this discussion. I'm glad, I'm honored to be a part of this. And yeah, I mean, what's coming to me? Yeah, let's continue with sincere efforts to restore the child protection aspect of Prabhupada's movement to the spirit that Prabhupada gave.
Thank you so much, Prabhu. And I think lastly, just to illustrate what we said right in the beginning, our intention here is to try and acknowledge the issue, but we are praying for, hoping for, and working towards healing for everyone. So we would like the abusers to be healed as well. We would like the victims to heal, and we would like society to heal, and we would also like the leadership to heal. But in order for healing to take place of any disease, you first need to acknowledge that the disease is there. So thank you so much, everyone that joined us, and we're looking forward to hearing more of your comments, hearing more of your questions, and seeing you in 2 weeks' time for our next discussion, again on children. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Thank you.
Okay.